All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at 2 Corinthians chapters 1 through 3.
Sounds good to me.
So we'll see what kind of insights we can pull out of this letter from Paul.
Yeah, to the church in Corinth, right?
Right. This is Paul writing to this early church in Corinth. And a lot of times, we can think of these letters as, ancient history, right? Stuff that's just kind of tucked away in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're going to see in these chapters is that it's so relevant. Like, it's dealing with things that we still face today: comfort, forgiveness, even how we live our lives as living letters.
Yeah, that's one of those phrases that really jumps out, right? Living letters. What does that even mean?
It's a really interesting idea, and we'll unpack that a bit more later.
Looking forward to it.
But before we jump into the text itself, it's probably helpful to have a little context.
Definitely.
So this letter we're looking at, to Corinthians, it's actually a follow-up to an earlier letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. And things weren't exactly peachy keen in this church.
Oh yeah, there's some drama going on, right?
Big time. They were dealing with all kinds of issues, divisions, false teachings, even questions about Paul's authority. So in this letter, he's trying to address these problems and bring them back to the core message of the gospel, the reality of the new covenant.
So we're not just talking about abstract theology here.
Not at all. We're talking about real-world problems, real-world struggles, and that's what makes these chapters so powerful.
Agreed. Paul doesn't shy away from the messiness of life. He dives right in.
Okay, so let's dive in with him. Chapter 1, Paul starts off by talking about God being this ultimate source of comfort.
Especially when we're going through tough times, trial, suffering, all that.
Yeah, exactly. He emphasizes that. And what really strikes me is how he doesn't just preach this idea from a distance, but he actually uses his own experiences to drive it home.
Makes it more real, I guess, like he's been there.
Exactly. He's not speaking from some ivory tower. He describes himself being burdened beyond strength, even despairing of life itself.
Wow, that's heavy stuff.
It is, and it makes his message of comfort all the more powerful because he gets it.
Right, it's not just some empty platitude. He's walked through the fire himself.
Yeah, and I think that's so important for us to remember, especially when we're going through hard times. We might be tempted to think, God, where are you in this?
Oh yeah, for sure. We've all been there.
But Paul's experience suggests that suffering doesn't mean God's absent. In fact, it can actually be an opportunity to experience his presence and his comfort more deeply.
Kind of like those times when you feel closest to God are often when you're at your lowest point.
Yeah, it's like in our weakness, his strength is made perfect. Okay, but let's get practical for a minute. How does this ancient letter, with all this talk of suffering and comfort, how does it speak to someone navigating the challenges of the 21st century?
Well, I think the pressures we face today are different. But in a lot of ways, they're the same. We're still dealing with anxiety, uncertainty, the feeling of being overwhelmed. And Paul's message reminds us that no matter what we're going through, God's comfort is available to us. He's there in the midst of it all.
So it's not just a message for ancient times, it's a message for right now, right here.
Exactly. It's timeless. And he doesn't stop there. He goes on to talk about a cycle of comfort.
A cycle? What's that all about?
Well, it's this idea that the comfort we receive from God isn't just for us to hoard. It's meant to be shared.
You mean like passing it on to others?
Exactly. We're called to be conduits of that comfort, to extend it to those who are hurting around us.
So it's not just about me and my problems. It's about looking outward, seeing the needs of others, and offering them that same comfort we've received.
Right. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together. We're all part of this body, and when one part suffers, we all suffer. And when one part is comforted, we all find comfort.
So it becomes less about me and my problems and more about how we can support and uplift each other.
Yeah. And by sharing the comfort we've received, we become part of this chain reaction of grace, this ripple effect that can touch countless lives.
That's a beautiful image. I love that. It makes you think, who in my life needs that kind of comfort right now? And how can I be that source of support for them?
It's a good question to ask ourselves regularly, for sure.
It is. But before we get too deep into that, let's move on to chapter 2, where things get a little messy.
Uh-oh, here comes the drama.
Yeah, Paul addresses this conflict in the Corinthian church and this whole issue of forgiveness.
Okay, so we're getting into the nitty-gritty of relationships now.
We are. And forgiveness is tough stuff. It's not just saying, it's okay, no worries.
No, it's so much deeper than that.
Right. It feels like Paul is trying to unpack something really profound here. What are the nuances of forgiveness that he's trying to get across?
Well, I think for Paul, Forgiveness is about breaking the hold that sin and wrongdoing have on both the offender and the offended. It doesn't condone the action, but it frees us from the bitterness and resentment that can eat us alive from the inside.
So it's not ignoring the hurt or pretending it didn't happen?
Nope, not at all.
Oh.
It's about acknowledging the pain, the very real damage that's been done, while choosing to release the offender from our judgment. It's letting go of that desire for revenge or retribution.
Okay, so we're acknowledging the hurt, but we're choosing to let go of the anger and resentment. Not easy.
Not at all. But it's essential for our own healing and for the restoration of relationships. And Paul actually uses a very specific Greek word for forgiveness here, aphiemi.
Aphiemi. What does that mean exactly?
It literally means to let go, to release.
Hmm.
It's an active decision, not just a passive feeling. And it's this act of letting go that opens the door to healing and reconciliation.
It makes me think of those times when I've held on to anger or resentment. It always ends up hurting me more than the other person.
Oh, absolutely. Unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. It keeps us trapped in this cycle of pain and bitterness.
Yeah.
But forgiveness, this radical act of letting go, it sets us free.
So how does forgiveness, this letting go, connect to the message of the new covenant? Because it feels like Paul's building towards something here.
Yeah, you're picking up on something important. The freedom that comes from forgiveness is directly tied to the freedom we have in Christ. And this is where chapter 3 comes in.
Chapter 3, all right. This is where Paul really digs into this contrast between the old and the new covenants.
Yeah, he gets pretty deep here.
He does. He talks about the old covenant being written on these stone tablets, like the 10 Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
But the new covenant, it's written on our hearts by the Spirit.
It's internal, not external.
Right. Like that seems like a huge shift.
Oh, it's a radical shift. To really grasp it, we got to think about the historical context.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful.
Paul's audience, they're steeped in Jewish tradition. The law, it was everything for them. Defined their identity, their relationship with God.
Their whole way of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Paul's saying, hey, in Christ, something new has come.
So are you saying it's not about following all those external rules anymore?
You got it. It's about an internal transformation. Happens through the Spirit.
Okay, so it's more about who we're becoming than what we know?
Right on. And in this transformation, we become living letters. Our lives, they actually express God's work.
Hold on, living letters. That's a pretty wild metaphor.
It is, right. It's one of Paul's favorites. He's saying God's message, it's no longer etched in stone. It's inscribed on our hearts.
Not with ink, though.
Nope, with the Spirit. And this inscription, it's not meant to be hidden away.
It's meant to be seen.
Exactly. By the world.
So our lives become the message.
You got it. It's letting the Spirit shape us from the inside out. Our actions, words, our whole being, it reflects Christ's character.
Powerful stuff.
And that brings us to one of the most powerful statements in this chapter. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom.
Okay, that sounds amazing. Freedom. But I think a lot of people, myself included, we struggle with what that freedom actually looks like practically.
Yeah, how does it play out in our everyday lives?
Exactly that.
Well, it's not about this freedom to just do whatever we want.
Oh, okay.
It's freedom from the things that hold us back, Fear, guilt, that pressure to always perform.
I feel that.
It's the freedom to live authentically, to love others without holding back, to embrace our imperfections, knowing God fully loves and accepts us.
So it's less about checking boxes and more about living from this place of grace and acceptance.
Absolutely. And this freedom, it empowers us to become more like Christ, to reflect his love and compassion. The world needs that desperately.
It does.
It's about letting our light shine, not because we've got it all figured out, but because we've been touched by God's grace.
That's beautiful. But this whole living letter thing, it also feels like a lot of pressure. What if my letter is, full of typos, grammatical errors? What if it's a bit messy and it doesn't really convey the message I want it to?
That's an honest question. And I think we all wrestle with that, honestly. None of us are perfect letters, right? We've got our flaws, those inconsistencies. We stumble. But that doesn't invalidate the message. Actually, it might make it more relatable.
Oh, you mean because it shows our imperfections, makes us more human.
Exactly. It allows others to see that following Christ, it's not about having it all together. It's about embracing our brokenness, letting God work in those weaknesses.
Letting his grace shine through those cracks.
You got it.
So it's not about pretending to be perfect, but being honest, authentic. Letting others see God's grace transforming us, even with the mess and all.
Precisely. And this brings us back to what Paul was saying about comfort, right?
Oh, yeah, back in chapter 1.
Yeah, how God comforts us in our afflictions. And here in chapter 3, he's saying this comfort isn't just for us to hold on to. It's meant to be shared.
To become a source of strength for others.
You got it.
So the comfort we receive, it becomes the comfort we give. It all ties together. But how does this living letter idea connect to this idea of glory that Paul keeps bringing up?
That's a great question. In the Old Covenant, glory was often connected to these outward displays, right? Power and majesty.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. Like the Israelites seeing the Red Sea part? Or the thunder and lightning at Mount Sinai?
Exactly. But in the New Covenant, glory takes on this different dimension.
So less about those big external displays.
Right. Paul describes it as a glory that comes from the Lord, a glory revealed through our transformed lives.
So the more we let God work in us, the more his glory becomes visible.
You got it. And he says we're being transformed from glory to glory, meaning the more we surrender to God's work, the more his character shines through.
So it's not about us striving for perfection, but about yielding to the Spirit's transforming power.
Right. Letting him shape us into Christ's image.
And as we're transformed, it impacts everything, right?
You got it. Our relationships, work, interactions with the world, it becomes this radiant light, drawing others to the source of that light.
That's powerful. It makes me think about how we can get so caught up trying to be good or do the right thing. But maybe the real challenge is letting go of that striving and letting God's grace transform us.
I think you're right on. It's not about earning God's favor, but surrendering to his love, letting that love flow through us.
So instead of asking, what do I need to do to be a good Christian? We ask, how is God inviting me to become more like Christ?
Beautiful. I think that captures the essence of being a living letter.
Okay, we've covered a lot here. Comfort in suffering, the freedom of the new covenant. What are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, first off, Paul's reminding us we're not alone in our struggles. He's been there.
Yeah.
And he points us to the God who comforts us in our pain.
And it's not just about receiving comfort, but becoming a source of comfort for others. We're all interconnected.
Exactly. And then this radical idea of being living letters, letting go of our striving, embracing imperfections, letting God transform us.
Not about proving our worth, but recognizing we're already loved and accepted, empowered by God to reflect his glory.
You said it perfectly. And that glory is not about outward displays, but about the inward transformation by the Spirit. It shines through our compassion, forgiveness, our willingness to love, even when it's tough.
It's woven into our everyday lives, the way we treat our family, our colleagues, everyone around us.
And ultimately, it points beyond ourselves, drawing others to the one who's the source of all light and love.
Okay, I feel like we've really unpacked a lot, but before we wrap up, I've got one more question about this whole living letter thing.
Shoot.
If the Spirit is doing this amazing work writing on our hearts, shouldn't it be visible? It can't just be internal, right?
Yeah, you're right. It should be visible. And that's where this living letter metaphor gets really interesting.
Okay, how so?
Think about a letter, real letter. You don't just stick it in a drawer.
Right, you send it.
It's meant to be read, to communicate something.
So if we are the letters,
Our lives, they gotta communicate something too.
our lives become the message.
You got it. And that message should reflect the transformation that's happening inside through the Spirit.
So it's not just about what we say we believe.
Nope, it's about how we actually live.
Our actions.
Words, attitudes, relationships, the whole thing. They all become part of the message we're sending to the world.
It's like we're each holding up a sign, and the question is, what's on your sign?
Exactly. What message are you putting out there?
That's a powerful thought. It makes me think about my own life, the message I'm sending. But what if I'm not even sure what my sign says? What if I'm still, figuring things out, making mistakes, trying to find my way?
That's totally okay. We're all works in progress. The important thing is that we're open to God's leading, letting him shape us into the image of his Son.
So it's more about being honest about where we are, acknowledging our weaknesses and trusting that God's working in us, even with all our imperfections.
Yes. And remember, the message we're called to communicate, it's not about perfection. It's about grace. It's about forgiveness. It's about the power of God's love to heal and redeem, even those really broken parts of ourselves.
It's about letting others see that even when things are messy, God's still working, still shaping us, still using us to share his love. And that's a message worth sharing.
Absolutely. That's a message the world needs to hear.
This has been such an incredible deep dive into 2 Corinthians 1-3, comfort in suffering, forgiveness, becoming these living letters that reflect God's work in us. What's one final thought you would want to leave our listeners with?
If I could sum it all up, I'd say this. Embrace your imperfections. Let yourself be shaped by God's grace. Trust that even in your messiness, you are a powerful testament to Christ's love, and that love has the power to transform.
That is beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Second Corinthians. We hope it's given you some new insights and challenged you to live out your faith in a bold and authentic way.
Until next time, remember, you are a living letter. What message will you write